Good morning, everybody. If you're on the other side of the Atlantic, we're in Europe. And good afternoon, those who are in Europe. And I don't know if we have any Asia followers. Good evening if you're there, or good night. We're delighted to be Carnegie Europe and co-hosting this major event with Pew. I'm sure everybody's familiar with their extraordinary polling techniques and their analysis. And this is a first shared event, and we're immensely looking forward to it. And it's a very timely event because it's dealing with the complexities of politics, economics, and culture, cultural identity, populism, in the context of the corona pandemic, and raising very important questions about, is there a need for reform? Is there disappointment with the elites? Firstly. Secondly, what sort of economies do we want now and afterwards, when the pandemic is over? And thirdly, feeding into this is the idea of identity, of populism, of inclusivity. And the third paper, this one on culture, is very, very interesting because it really does debunk a lot of theories that, in fact, the countries are becoming more inclusive. And just one brief thing about the countries. These are very important, this group of countries that Pew have chosen. It's Great Britain, no longer in the EU. It's the United States, which is really interesting now in the post-Trump era. We have Germany, as Chancellor Merkel ends her last term in September. And we have France, as President Macron prepares for elections next year. So curiously, America doesn't seem to be in flux. Great Britain is Great Britain, and they've got local elections this coming week. But in flux really is Germany and France, which makes the three surveys really, really interesting. So I'm going to kick off immediately with our great two Pew authors, Richard Wike and Laura Silver. Richard, please. You have about 8 to 10 minutes to give your presentation, followed by Laura, and then I will approach our other guests. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Judy, and thanks to Rosa and Kalypso for being here as well. Thanks to everybody in the audience. Laura and I are really excited to have a chance to talk with you about this report that we just released today on views about national identity and some cultural issues in the US, UK, France, and Germany. And we've released some reports over the last few weeks from that same survey, including some looking at political reform and attitudes towards economic reform. And if you look across those reports, there are a lot of themes that emerge, I think, but one of the ones that's most interesting to me is how people feel about change and reform. Especially as we all hopefully emerge from the pandemic in the coming months. I think there's going to be a lot of emphasis on what kind of changes people want in their lives and in their countries. So what I'll do is talk briefly about some of the findings that we have that speak to attitudes towards change and reform in the political sphere, the economic sphere, and on culture as well. And then I'll hand it off to Laura, who will dig a little bit more deeply into the cultural findings from today's report. So if you want to move on to the first slide, I'll briefly tell you a little bit more about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. As it says here, we're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust. We are nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy. So we don't make policy recommendations. We focus on empirical research and leave the policy recommendations to others. Next slide, please. Here's a little bit of information about the methodology for this survey. And of course, we're happy to answer additional questions about it. Note the field period. It was from November 10th through December 23rd. So that's after the US election, but before Biden takes office, before the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. These are all telephone interviews, and these are all nationally representative samples. So that means that the demographic profile of our samples very closely matches the demographic profile of a country's adult population. Next slide, please. So let me start off with some findings about how many people, at least in these countries, are frustrated with politics. A couple of examples of that here. We read people the statement, most politicians are corrupt, and asked them whether that describes their country well or not. And as you can see, in the US in particular, people say yes, it does. 67% of Americans essentially say that most politicians are corrupt. It's a little less than half in France and the UK, and then about 3 in 10 in Germany. And this pattern is something that you'll see on a lot of these findings. Germans are a little less frustrated with the functioning of their political and economic systems compared to people in the other 3 countries. Then on the other side of the slide here, you can see that we read the statement, elected officials care what ordinary people think. And you've got half or more in France, the US, and the UK saying, no, I don't think so. I don't think that describes our country well. Lower again in Germany. So, what we see here on this slide, I think, is something that we see in a lot of questions we ask in these countries and elsewhere, which is that among many, at least, there's a sense of frustration with political elites and a sense that political elites are out of touch with ordinary citizens. Next slide, please. So here's a question that gets at the extent to which people think their political system needs change. So do you think the political system in our country needs to be completely reformed, needs major changes, minor changes, or no changes at all? And as you can tell, in France and the US in particular, many people believe significant changes are necessary. It's 2 in 3 in both countries who say either the political system needs a complete overhaul or at least needs major changes. It's about half in the UK and then around 4 in 10 in Germany. So some differences across countries, but in all these countries, a significant block of citizens at least thinks that the political system needs significant reform. Next slide, please. And so a couple of political reforms that we asked about on the survey get broad support. Citizen assemblies and referendums. As you can see here, 7 in 10 or more in all 4 countries say it's important to have citizen assemblies, and about 4 in 10 or so say it's very important. And then when you look at the referendum, there's also a lot of support for having referendums as well, maybe a little bit lower than when we ask about citizen assemblies. Now, the devil may be in the details when you are talking about these kind of reforms, right? But at the very least, I think what these findings suggest is that people are interested in citizen assemblies and in direct democracy. And I think it speaks more broadly to what we see in many of the questions we ask, which is that people want citizens to have a more active voice in policymaking. Next slide, please. So we also asked about the economic system. Here you can see one very similar to the question we saw a moment ago about the political system. In this case, how much change do you think is necessary for the economic system? Does it need to be completely reformed, major changes, minor changes, or no change? And here, France really stands out. 7 in 10 say we at least need major changes and maybe a complete overhaul. In other countries, it's about half. So in some ways, if you're looking at the US, UK, and Germany, it's a dividing line. About half the public thinks there needs to be significant change to the economic system. About half thinks it needs to be changed in a smaller way. But significant blocks, again, are interested in economic change. And one of the things that we saw as well in this survey is that when we asked about particular policy proposals, there was a fair amount of support for all of those. So things like doing more to help the poor in these countries, job training, increasing taxes on the wealthy, universal basic income. It varies a little bit from country to country and across those questions, but overall, we saw a lot of support for the notion of greater government intervention in the economy. Next slide, please. Now, this slide looks at a combination, essentially, of that question about economic reform and the question about political reform. So if you look at France, for example, 57% in France are in favor of significant reform to both the economic system and the political system. It's just 18% who say neither one needs significant reform. And there's a little less support for reform in the other 3 countries, although in no country do even 4 in 10 say that neither the economic system nor political system need reform. And in all countries, you've got significant blocks who say that both of these systems need major reform. Next slide, please. And then this question pivots to the cultural issues a little bit and asks in a different way about cultural change. So we ask people, which comes closer to your view? Our country would be better off if it sticks with traditions and its ways of life, or our country would be better off in the future if it's open to changes regarding its traditions and its ways of life. So in all of these countries, you've got half or more, and as many as 2 and 3 in the UK saying the change is good, essentially, and we were better off if we're open to changes. Although, again, significant numbers don't feel that way, right? Significant numbers think we need to stick to tradition. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that there's significant ideological differences when it comes to this question, especially in the United States. 65% in the US among conservatives say we need to stick to our traditions. It's just 6% among self-identified liberals in the US. And significant, although smaller differences ideologically in the other countries as well. And this pattern is something you'll see on just about every question we ask about culture. Big ideological differences across the 4 countries, and they're especially sharp in the United States. And Laura actually has a blog post out today that looks at these ideological differences in more detail. So, there are a lot of people in these countries who are interested in political and economic reform, and many are in favor of cultural change as well. But it's not everyone, and of course, the kind of change they want, differs. And there's some big differences along ideological lines as well. So I'll stop there. If you want to move on to the next slide, and Laura, I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thanks so much, Richard. What I'm going to present to you today are the specific cultural issues we asked about on the report that comes out this morning, I guess probably about 12 minutes ago at this point. The specific questions that we asked about are largely derived from a series of focus groups we held in the US and the UK. We did 26 groups across the 2 countries, and we really asked people about issues of nationalism and issues of cosmopolitanism and globalization. And the topics that came up most regularly informed the topics that you'll see here. Because of time, I'm not going to get into the qualitative findings right now, but would be very excited to talk about it in the question and answer period if that's of interest. Next slide. One of the things that we wanted to understand is what it takes to be truly part of the country, to be truly German, to be truly French, British, or American. And we asked a series of questions about which issues are most important. Whether or not, for example, to be truly German, you need to be able to speak the country's dominant language. You can see, for example, that across all 4 countries, a large majority of people think that it's at least somewhat important to be able to speak the country's language. And it's almost everyone who says that in Germany and France. And in fact, 2/3 or more in both of those countries say it's very important. When it comes to issues of sharing the country's customs and traditions, again, majorities tend to say that this is important, but to a lesser extent than the dominant language issue. 2 other issues, though, which are seen as slightly less important in both countries, are whether it's important to have been born in the country and to be Christian. But here I'll point you towards one area where the United States stands out somewhat. In the US, around 1 in 5 say it's very important to be Christian, which is quite a bit higher than in the other 4 countries. Next slide. These are actually trend questions for us, and we asked them both in 2016 and in 2020. When it comes to the political dynamics in 2016, clearly it was a height of immigration being a sensitive issue. In the European context, we obviously had the refugee surge. In the United States, we had the contentious election in 2016 where build the wall and immigration were clear-cut issues that were dominating the fore. So in some ways, it's not particularly surprising that the emphasis on some of these factors, including having been born in the country and sharing the country's customs and traditions, has decreased across some of these countries between 2016 and 2020. However, a handful of issues remain somewhat important, particularly in Germany and France. Most notably, in both of those countries, we see no sharp decline in the percent who say it's important to speak the dominant language, even while we see some decline in the US and the UK. But generally speaking, the emphasis on all of these, kind of the criteria for national belonging, have become less strict across most of these countries and across most ideological groups, though much of it is actually driven by change among those on the left. Next slide. Another question that we asked, which gets at the issue of immigration and assimilation, is a forced choice question where we asked whether immigrants in our country today want to adopt our customs and way of life, or if immigrants today want to be distinct from our society. In the European context, we've been asking this question over time since 2014, and you can see that particularly in the UK and Germany, there's been a sharp increase in the percent of people who say immigrants today want to adopt our customs and way of life. In France, while there's been a small uptick since 2014, it's held relatively steady since 2018. And in the US, while we only started asking the question in 2018, we see a large increase, and today around 2/3 of Americans say immigrants in our country want to adopt our customs and way of life. So in every country, either a majority or slightly more people say that immigrants today want to adopt our customs. Next slide. And here, actually, a lot of the change that we see is actually driven by people on the right and in the center. You can see, for example, in the United Kingdom, that today, while people on the left are more likely to say that immigrants want to adopt our customs and way of life, the share of the right, that blue line, increased from 33% who felt that way in 2018 to 56% who felt that way in 2020, while a smaller increase is seen among those on the center or right. In most of the countries surveyed, this general pattern holds, where we tend to see that people on the left are more likely to say immigrants want to adopt our customs, but the share of the right who have this position has increased over time. Next slide. Another issue we wanted to understand is general thoughts about patriotism or national pride. So we asked a question about whether or not people are proud of their country most of the time, often proud and often ashamed of their country, or ashamed of their country most of the time. Here you can see that there's some division. Germans tend to be relatively more proud. 53% say they're proud most of the time, while we see only around 4 in 10 or so in France, the UK, and the US say the same. And in fact, in the US, half say they're often proud and often ashamed. When it comes to who feels proud and who feels shame, though, there are quite notable differences. First, the issue is ideologically divisive, but only in the US and UK. In Germany and France, ideology doesn't really play a role in the issue of pride. In the US and the UK, though, those on the right are substantially more likely to say they're proud most of the time. And in fact, those on the left are equally likely to say they're ashamed most of the time as to say they're proud most of the time. Next slide, please. But some of the cultural issues that we heard about in our focus groups that were particularly divisive or seemed to kind of draw people's ire, or they were left with quite a bit of detail to give, had to do with discrimination, who was discriminated against, and issues of politically correct culture. So I want to share some of that here. Next slide. First, we wanted to understand in particular which groups people feel are discriminated against in their society. And while these are not exhaustive, we did ask about 3 specific religious groups on this survey. A few patterns stand out on this slide. First is that generally speaking, in most of these countries, more people tend to say that Muslims face a lot or some discrimination in society today than say the same of Jews and Christians. The relatively notable exception being in Germany, where about as many say that Muslims and Jews face discrimination today. Generally speaking, too, people see less discrimination against Christians than against Muslims and Jews. But here the United States stands out. Almost half of Americans say that Christians today face a lot or some discrimination in their society today. And this was definitely something that was palpable in our focus groups. Many of the things that people raised had to do with changes being done to schools or changes to winter festivals being called that instead of Christmas festival. And much of the discussion centered around Christians being discriminated against in order to allow for multiculturalism. Next slide. So one of the things we wanted to understand then is which is a bigger issue for people today? People not seeing discrimination where it really does exist, or people seeing discrimination where it really does not exist? And here you can see some variation across the countries. Around 2/3 of Germans say people not seeing discrimination where it really does exist is a bigger deal, and around 6 in 10 or slightly more in the US and the UK say the same. In France, though, the pattern is reversed. Slightly more people say people seeing discrimination where it does not exist is the bigger problem for society when it comes to discrimination against ethnic and racial minority groups. Next slide. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the issue of politically correct culture, which I know is relatively salient today when we have rulings, for example, about President Trump and Facebook just coming out mere moments before this briefing. Generally speaking, in the countries that we surveyed, slightly more people tend to say that people today are too easily offended by what others say, rather than the fact that people should be careful what they say to avoid offending others. The notable exception to this pattern here is in Germany, where slightly more than half say people should be careful to avoid offending others. So clearly, some of these cultural touch points are sizable issues in these countries where we see at the general population level, around half falling on either side of these various dichotomous issues. And then as Richard stressed, and as we can talk about more in the discussion, these tend to be large ideological cleavages in each of the countries. So on this particular issue and the other ones that I walked through, the gap between the left and the right tends to be quite stark, and particularly in the United States. On this issue, for example, the right tends to be much more likely to say that people today are too easily offended than those on the left. Next slide. So all of this research that we just presented today can now be found live on our website, and we look forward to the discussion that will follow and the question and answer. Thank you.
That was super. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Richard. You raised so many interesting questions. We should have 5 hours discussing this instead of 1 hour. Really, really interesting. I'm not going to abuse my role as moderator by asking both of you questions. We can deal with this in the conversations and the Q&A later. Rosa, I want to go quickly to you. What I found very interesting is this yearning for reform. And yet, if you take the case of France, successive French presidents have been saying, we need political reform, we need social reform, we need economic reform. And the Pew Research shows, yes, there's support for this. But when it actually comes to delivering, the society seems to be against it. And we've seen any number of, whether it's riots or demonstrations or protests, whether it's reforming the railway system or the pension system or the public sector system or the environment. I mean, what does reform mean, really? Because it really does mean challenging the status quo, but you're a long observer of this. Are the publics willing to pay for reform?
Thank you, Judy. That's a great question. Indeed, I think that is probably the most significant single finding from all the research across the 3 reports, the demands for reform, and it embraces both economic reform and political reform. And there are 2 things I'd like to say. I mean, the first is, and I think this goes in the direction of trying to understand, which is the question I've been posing myself, trying to understand why it has been so successful. Are you hearing an echo? Is that, or is it,
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Fine. Okay. So, I've been asking myself, why is it that populism has been so successful? And the mainstream explanations for this are twofold. One is its culture, its identity, and of course we have the report on this. And the other is about economics. It's about rising inequalities. It's about rising poverty. And I've been arguing that actually these are variables, but the underlying theme that accumulates the frustration, that interprets the frustration of Europeans in particular, because I tend to focus on Europe, is actually a demand for democracy. People want to be heard. And I think this really came out very clearly from all the findings. However, admittedly, and I think, again, this comes out from the findings, is that even though we have greater majorities in favor of progressive politics than a few years ago, these are still polarizing issues. And that is why reform has failed in certain countries. That is why France struggles so much to push forward certain reforms. And I guess that is the reason for the problems in France. I'd like to just add one point about Macron and what has happened in France, and that is that he has organized citizens' assemblies, and they've actually been quite a significant movement. And a significant experience for the French people. But what our government, and the EU is about to launch the Conference on the Future of Europe, what are governments going to do with it? Not very much, I fear. And that risks being another issue that will frustrate publics further. I'd like to say more on the economy, but I won't, because I think my sound is very good at the moment. So I'll let you move to Kalypso.
Super. Rosa, thank you. You've raised a lot of very complex issues that are actually quite difficult to answer because of shifting opinion polls and shifting views. And as Richard says, there's the element of the corruption, and as Laura says, this whole attitude towards inclusivity is there, but you wonder, is it when you actually look at the ground in certain societies? Which brings me to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to have Kalypso here. And Kalypso, I'm so pleased you're not on the bus, so you'll be here. I want to raise this question. we have the corruption, we have the need for reform, but sometimes I think reform could be implemented if there's a greater communication between the elites, between the governed and the citizens. Are we getting to an issue of democracy and trust here?
Indeed, Judy. First of all, let me say I can't resist not only thanking Richard and Laura for a wonderful survey, but also the extraordinary Pew team for really supporting teachers like me over the many years, dare I say decades. So thank you. And in this is really a rich, multifaceted diagnosis. And it's not, we've known people want change. Right? And Rosa was saying it again, you were saying it. But I think this COVID era helps people articulate it more cogently, more forcefully. Except here's the problem you demonstrate. They want different kinds of change. Okay, maybe not surprising, but the beauty of the report and the 3 reports, as I hear them, and we've just heard now about report 3, which seems as fascinating as the other 2, is that what is wonderful is when you're surprised. And here is one of the many surprises for me, which is that there seems to be a kind of triangle here. We have a civil society that indeed wants change, including of traditions, as you were just describing, Laura. And indeed, perhaps also because in this new era of COVID, I've been defending the idea that it has opened up our political imagination, one way or another. So it's not just the dark side on democracy of COVID. But so you've got the civil society, the citizens answering your survey. But then you have the system, economic and political, that they want to change, something called the systems. And then thirdly, you have governments that they actually trust more. And so you have this gap between change of the system, but trust in the government. So what that suggests is that maybe there is indeed an alliance between governments and citizens to change a system, to create a new kind of social glue. And that's where your question comes in, Judy, because what does it take? Well, it's the title of your report, trust, lack of trust. So how do we, and so what I wanted to say is, how do we take from your report the suggestion about what to do between this relationship between democracy and trust. And let me suggest 3 avenues for thinking about this. Because what is clear from the report is that the era of blind trust, deferential, hierarchical, etc., is over forever. So instead, where we need to go is much more trust based on monitoring. Citizens want to know what's going on. Because at the end of the day, you show in this report 3 that belonging is sticky through language, etc. But at the same time, and maybe that's again a COVID thing, interconnectedness is important. And so people may want to belong, but I was fascinated by the fact of the variance on proud and ashamed that you showed. And why is the US the least proud? As someone who lived there for so long, I was very surprised and also most aware of discrimination. So what we need here in our democracy is not to simply want some sort of shifts in loyalty, but kind of process remedies where people are involved in a kind of democratic panopticon. They see each other, they start trusting each other because they understand each other better, not because they change deep down their identity within societies and across society. And I think that's very important in Europe. The second, Judy, very, very quickly, is kind of deliberative trust. I'm just echoing Rosa here. We're having a maybe there is an unintentional democratic courage in Europe right now to kind of reassert these other ways of doing democracy, citizens' assembly, referendum. That's what I think the reports show. And indeed, your report simply says that, okay, we want this to happen, but we don't think politicians will listen to us. They don't care what people think, is what you tell us. So how do you remedy that? How do you create a democracy that is a deliberation that are effective, that have effect? And here I also want to pick up on this last point that Laura was making about differences and polarization on discrimination and offense. Maybe there are limits to deliberation because people just think very differently. And that's maybe why we need to reflect on acknowledging people's ambivalence and engaging with each other's ambivalence. And the last point I'll make, Judy, is that maybe deliberation is not enough. When we need is not just deliberative trust, but binding trust, stuff that kind of binds societies. And that's where the kind of policies that you talk about in the first report come to life, because what you show is that people increasingly care about, well, let's talk about the infrastructure of care, the human capital that is this infrastructure of care. They want politicians to speak to people's life, this job issue, the basic income. This is fighting against precarity more than against inequality. And indeed, at the end of the day, we need to ask, where will people side if in the biggest question of our time, which is who are the guardians of our democracy? Who people trust to be the states or corporation? And here maybe your report shows the biggest variance between Europe and the US, states, corporation. But in all cases, it's about civil society, being the guardians of the guardians, as it were. So this is the kind of insights that I hear from your reports.
I mean, these are really, your remarks, Kalypso, feed into Richard's analysis, especially of the political issue. Richard, what we don't want is to have another report in 10 years' time saying that corruption hasn't been dealt with. And actually, corruption is a big issue. I mean, there's minor corruption, there's major corruption, there's corruption in Central Europe, there's corruption here in the health system over the vaccines and how some of them skip the queue. There's corruptions, but the culture of corruption seems to be much bigger. And it seems to me that if you don't tackle corruption, it'll be very difficult to tackle reform. So how do you deal with this issue of corruption, which feeds into the democracy issue, which feeds into the trust issue, and which feeds into the perception issue that actually democracy just doesn't work for us?
Yeah, as you say, I mean, corruption is a big issue, and it's related to this distrust that people feel for leaders and institutions in many cases. I thought that, in some ways, both Rosa and Kalypso touched on some interesting things about the role of citizens and what citizens want. Kalypso, you talked about, the desire for people to be more actively involved in deliberation about politics and to more actively be involved in monitoring what government does and making sure government delivers, right? And I think we see a lot of that in our surveys in different ways. And then, Rosa, you touched on how a lot of these debates around what's driven populism in recent years tend to sort of pit culture versus economics and things like that. And, both of those are probably really important, but there are probably some distinctly political elements as well, right? People, as you said, are demanding more democracy. People want citizens to have a bigger role in making decisions in terms of where their country's headed on politics and economics and other things. So, I think there's a real hunger among many, at least, for citizens to have a more prominent role in policy making and deliberation about where their countries are headed. And maybe if that were to happen, Judy, that would address some of the mistrust and some of this gap that we see between citizens and the political leaders who represent them.
Thanks for that, Richard. Laura, can I jump in here? In your report on culture and identity, unless I'm mistaken, you don't touch very much on the social media and how that has an atomizing effect. And it puts so many different groups into compartments where their worldviews are reaffirmed over and over, which is why I find your report quite optimistic. But I was wondering, when it comes to trust, when it comes to corruption, when it comes to democracy, when it comes to acceptance of others, how is the role of the social media really that important?
It's a great question. We learned a lot about how people talked about social media in the focus groups that we did. And in fact, some of it is atomizing, but some of it is connecting, depending on the issue and the community about which you're speaking. So we heard in the focus groups, for example, that some people found social media to be a bridge with their neighbors. They might not have the normal social ties that Robert Putnam would want us to have with their neighbors, but because they're on platforms like Nextdoor, or because they are on Facebook groups with their neighbors, they actually learn more about their local and community events than they would have otherwise. There's also some ability to bridge, obviously, borders and to speak with people cross-nationally about specific issues. But as you say, it can be atomizing and there can be media echo bubbles. I think that's not something we've studied a lot in the United States through another team at the Pew Research Center. The issue of media polarization in the US is obviously quite distinctive. A study that we did, though, in the past in European countries suggested that at least in certain countries, and particularly in the UK, that issue may not be as pronounced as in at least the United States and some of the Scandinavian countries that we surveyed, because the BBC tends to still be dominant. So social media plays a role, but so do traditional media systems. And with large national broadcasters in some of these countries, I'm not positive what role we would expect to see in terms of kind of these echo bubbles.
Thanks for that, Laura. All four of you, in some ways, what connects the four of you is this issue of change. And I find this, I find the shift in the right towards believing that minorities want to adapt and adopt. That is really new, Laura. I find this very reassuring, actually. But then we have the issue of change. Yes, we want reform, but it actually means change. And any of you can jump in here. When we talk about the citizens' assemblies, I mean, they're meant to affect change, but for some, the citizens' assemblies will be a new kind of elite, frankly, because they're generally civil society, middle-class groups. But what do we mean when we talk about reform and change? Is it a new kind of democracy, or is it a new kind of representation? I'm trying to work out the three links between the three reports and how the four of you actually do dwell on this issue of change, how it's so necessary. I really should ask somebody to reply, but Rosa, would you like to jump in here?
Okay, I'll jump in. On political, I'll say one thing about political change. In fact, I'll say a few things about political change. The first thing to say is that, and this is, this started in the 1980s, political parties have lost a lot of ground in the eyes of the public. They're losing out in terms of membership. They're losing out in terms of votes. We've seen a rise in plenty more political parties. Some have exploded out of nothing. Some have disappeared. Yesterday, Ciudadanos was outvoted from the Madrid regional elections. He lost from 26 seats to 0. Okay, Ciudadanos did not exist 5 or 6 years ago. So one issue is that political parties have lost the role they used to play as a link between government and society. So I think that's one dynamic that we're seeing, which has been happening for the past 2 or 3 decades. That is particularly critical. The other is that politics and representation have become more complex.
Yeah.
And because they are more complex, it's important to devise diversified forms of engagement at different levels. So in the EU, but also at the US, you have the federal level, the state level, the local level, and you can play around with different forms of democratic processes, from deliberative, participative, consultations, depending on which level you're working on. And you can also build horizontal ties between states, between groups in society. So it's much more network. For politics to work, it needs to be much more network. And I think that's the particular change that is needed.
But you see, Rosa and Kalypso, I want to take you up on this. You see, if the networks that existed after World War II have largely disappeared. We're talking about the trade unions, especially in Europe. We're talking about the trade unions. We're talking about the churches. We're talking about the affiliations related to political parties for sports clubs. There was a whole network of social support, whether it was even agrarian movements and so on. And generally with the change of generations, this has disappeared and hasn't been replaced. And there's no doubt that the political parties, especially here in Germany, they're just so old. They were stunned with the Constitutional Court ruling last week that debunked the climate change thing because it was handed to the next generation. I mean, there's very little consideration of youth. So my question is this: as the old networks have generally disappeared, and correspondingly the old established parties haven't adapted, who's going to drive this change, and who's going to not preserve, but actually give democracy a kind of new impetus and meaning? Kalypso.
Well, one thing it's a big question, but one thing I take from the Pew Research is that in a way we have two extremes. We have, because of all of this modes of belonging between society and governments, who's occupying it, parties, unions have withered away, countries territorial ways have taken over on one hand. Laura was just telling us about neighborhoods. COVID has made it stark that we have these various little places of autonomy, that is our family, our neighborhood, but also our country, our region, our state within the US, etc. So that's one thing, and this kind of belonging is still there very, very strongly, defined by language, etc. So that's there. And on the other hand, something completely opposite, which is virtual communities, e-communities. Sometimes they connect, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're global. And again, COVID has shown that we watch each other demonstrate, protest, be under COVID across the globe. So you've got these two pillars of change, the very territorial and the very virtual, driven the second by technology. And the big question is, can change happen by bringing the two together? And I found it, as you did, Judy, very encouraging that this understanding of migrants, those who come elsewhere from outside our territory, has changed or is slowly, it's all very incremental from your polls. They want to become more like us. And maybe that shows that there are other glues that are coming up.
Thanks, Kalypso, for this. Before I go on to the question, Richard and Laura, what I find fascinating about these reports is that actually, while there is a longing for change, they still want the nanny state and they still want Angela Merkel to deliver. I mean, with Corona, there's been a kind of mismatch. As long as the state keeps paying for us, if we lose our jobs and get vaccinated, the state plays still a crucial role in the psychology and in the public space. But that's for another issue. I have a question here. This will interest all of you, actually, Richard and Laura particularly. It's from Catherine Woolard, Director at the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. And the question is this: hello, Catherine, if you're out there. Is there evidence that citizens want to be more involved? It's often proposed as an answer to legitimacy crisis, but could it not be that we want politicians to do better rather than to participate? Oh, I've got to say hi to her from Rosa. Hi. Yes. That's a really interesting question. I mean, this idea of participation. I mean, do we really want to participate or leave it up once more to the politicians, doers?
Yeah, Richard. I think in different ways we do see signs, of course, that people do want to participate. We see interest in things like voting or protesting or going online and voicing your opinions and things like that. It varies a lot, right? It varies across demographic groups and that kind of thing. I think even more important, perhaps, and maybe more universal, is that people want to be listened to, right? They want to be represented, and that's their real frustration with institutions and leaders, and as we talked about, traditional political parties. people don't necessarily feel like their interests are being represented by those institutions that have been around a long time. And that's driving a lot of the frustration that people feel. And that's opened up kind of political space for populists, for new political movements and things like that. So, I think it's that disconnect that is driving a lot of the frustration. And maybe that could be remedied by more participation in a way, but really about being listened to in one way or another.
I wonder, should we be much more radical about this and just lower the voting age and really give politics and participation a completely new meaning? Because, the kids around us now, they know so much, they're so politically aware, and they want their rights. And I was wondering if we want to not kickstart, but give democracy a push, should we change the whole structure of voting?
We haven't polled about this directly in our cross-national surveys, but we've done a lot of work recently as a center on attitudes towards voting. And at least in the United States, where most of this work has been done, the issue of who votes and who is allowed to vote and the manner in which they vote has become incredibly politically divisive and increasingly so. So I can't speak to the other three contexts because we haven't done the research in those particular countries, and we'll be interested in future surveys to look at attitudes towards democracy in these new and kind of varied ways. But in the United States, the idea that more people should be enfranchised is not a given.
That's very interesting. I mean, enfranchisement is such a political issue, always on the voting registers and so on. But Kalypso and Rosa and myself, I know so many teenagers that want to vote. I think Austria has lowered the limit at the moment. But isn't this a practical way of building trust and representation and democracy? Just changing the way we vote?
I couldn't agree with you more, Judy. And in a way, to me, it throws back a question to the Pew team, because there is this question that Laura was raising, who wants it? But behind who will vote is about what? And I think all our societies are pivoting to democracy for the long term, democracy with foresight, a kind of pedagogy of, yes, of course, we have to sometimes sacrifice the end of the month, for the end of the world, as it were, to deal with the end of the world. That's what our young people want. But if we do that, it has to be under certain conditions, compensate the losers in the short term, etc. How do we do that? It's a complex thing. Tocqueville said, democracy is all about the short term. And markets are about the short term. So how do people feel about, really reorienting to the long term? Very much a kind of Biden agenda. If that's the case, this is the backdrop for thinking about, young people being given more rights, which I completely agree with you, Judy. But I would like to hear from the research, how do we make this happen? How do we understand the way people handle democracy to make this more likely?
Good,
Richard, please.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, we haven't asked about, lowering the voting age, but this conversation makes me think that'd be a really interesting thing for us to try to ask about across nationally. Just to know, one of the things that we see a lot is, for one thing, we do see that in some cases, young people are more worried about the long-term future than their older counterparts, to your point, Kalypso. And something else when it comes to young people and participation is, as we all know, something that's really important to them in many countries is the online version of political participation, right? They're much more likely to express their political opinions on social media, much more likely to, get information about politics and things like that, via online sources. So I think in thinking about how to get young people involved, that's certainly a part of it. That's where they're going to turn for information about politics. That's where they're going to think about in terms of opportunities to express their voices. So, beyond voting, there's other forms of participation that we can think about as well.
But Richard, this feeds into the second report on the economy. I mean, young people, they want to know where some signpost towards the future, towards employment or opportunity, prospects, and so on. And I'm puzzled by the second report because, again, it goes. Those who were asked do want change, but it's not very clear what sort of economic change they want. Yes, perhaps the richer to pay more, but there's no clear-cut answer about the distribution of income. What is it for? Is it for the climate? Is it for education? Is it for the social welfare structures? And I was just wondering if you could just briefly give us some idea if there's any conclusion in this report about the extent of the change that they want in the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit in that report on some more specific economic measures. So things like UBI, raising taxes on the wealthy, spending more to help the poor, spending more on public housing. So there's a little bit there, I would say, that supports the notion of a more interventionist governmental approach, right. A little bit more redistributive in terms of policy options. So I think that there's a little bit of support for that kind of thing if you look at that report. Something else we've seen, and we'll have some new data on this soon, is that in all of these countries, there's a lot of concern about the long-term economic future. Many people think that the next generation is not going to be as well off economically as past generations and things like that. So, it is about today and specific things people want the government to do today to address, economies that are struggling. But there is also a real sense of long-term economic anxiety. So, if you're thinking about economic policies, I think it's got to do both, right? It's people's concerns are about today, but they're also focusing on the long term as well.
But Laura, this feeds into your report. If there isn't an upturn in the economy, especially in Europe, would there be a backlash against more migration?
It's a great question and something that we're definitely going to keep monitoring. But I think one of the things that unites these reports and something that we hope to explore more is one of the questions might be who should get these benefits. We see obviously support in the economic report that you were just alluding to, Richard, for things like UBI and for things like taxing the wealthy and other sorts of stimulus programs. But from the culture report, we also see that even while there's more acceptance of immigrants, there's still sharp divides in society. And many of them are ideological and some of them are age-related. So do people necessarily want everyone to receive all of these benefits like UBI, or might there still be a fraction of the population who cares about it only going to citizens or only going to people like them, however they define that? So I think that's something that we want to keep in mind and keep exploring.
And one last question to you, Laura, because I think it's quite important. There's a raging debate taking place in France at the moment, and maybe you saw this letter by generals and retired generals about the fear of a backlash, of a civil war, of the rise of Islam terrorism stuck in the suburbs and the banlieue. Your report is I'm very pleased it's optimistic. But I was wondering, is there an underlying, especially in France, an underlying worry that there's so many uncertainties along the way with regard to integration?
I think it depends how you read the report as to whether or not you view it as optimistic or pessimistic. On many of these questions, as Richard pointed out, for example, we see more people believe that we should be open to change than to stick with tradition. But we see very non-trivial percentages of the population saying the opposite. So it might be a minority in most countries, but when you're talking about 20 or 30% of people, in many of these cases who tend to be older or who tend to be affiliated with one side of the ideological spectrum, it can still be a really powerful block in a society and a powerful block that can influence parties and policy direction. And so I think that's one of the things that some of our German data has suggested over time, that we might have actually seen that many people were open to immigration even while the refugee crisis was going on. But depending on how politicians react, and particularly how Merkel and the party decided to take things, you see that the kind of right wing can still wield quite a bit of influence, particularly on immigration policy.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, Judy, I was just going to make two comments on what Richard and Laura said. One is that when Richard was talking about the more demand for more intervention, job training, etc., and I add to this a question you have about uncertainty and people who worry about uncertainty then want more reform.
wouldn't it be the case that people want less a target on inequality, but more on precarity, not just because there are some poor precarious class, but because somehow majorities in our country feel precarious.
Yes.
At different levels of income. My friend Albina Azmanova has written about this, but I think that's an important point across. And then the second question is to react to what Laura was just saying, because it's interesting, Laura, that you just said, depending on how politicians react. And one question I have, and I really love to get at through your surveys, is isn't it the case that deep down, a majority of people actually are quite ambivalent, and that's why their opinions can be fluid, as you show on immigrants. No, we don't hate them. We want to integrate them. We see that they do integrate. But depending on the filter that politics puts on it, as Machiavelli would have said, then people can get put in boxes, in extremes of that. Then that's what you catch with the survey. So you catch them when politics have put them in boxes. Effective polarization. If only, you talked about end of a political spectrum, but if only we could tap to some sort of more open opinions, I think it would be a big part of the population. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know if you get at that. It's an optimistic vision about political ambivalence.
But Kalypso, you're telling us actually to think out of the box. Since you mentioned Machiavelli, we have a question from Robert Cooper, who's just written a book about the ambassadors from Machiavelli to what is the road in modern times. And Robert, I don't know if Laura and Richard know Robert Cooper, a skilled diplomat who's very senior in the European Union service. This is Robert's question. It'll probably be our last question, but it's a cracker. Why not weigh votes according to life expectancy, since it's about the future? Well, there are countries that people that don't live in countries very long, but it's an interesting question as we nearly approach the end. So I'm going to give you all about a minute to deal with this, or you can duck it if you want, or be as radical and think out of the box if you want.
Well, I can jump in just real quick. I think, I don't know that we want to start weighting our surveys according to like people's life expectancies or something like that. But I think it's an interesting question, certainly, like how do people think about the future? And I think one way we might want to look at it are by like age differences or generational differences, right? And see, is it young people who are particularly worried about aspects of the future? What are their concerns? And, in some cases, they do have somewhat different concerns or, are more concerned about the long-term future. So from our perspective, it's keeping an eye out on that generational angle, I think, when we're looking at these questions about the future. Yeah.
Laura,
I agree with Richard. One of the things we do like to understand is not just how people feel differently by age at a given point in time, but how are their opinions changing as they age? Do we necessarily see people becoming more conservative, for example, or are there different effects that might come because of the political situation in which they grew up? The other thing I would say is, while that might be an interesting perspective, and I imagine younger people would be more inclined toward it, it would be interesting to see whether or not the buy-in from the people who would get less influence would necessarily be there. And I think that speaks to some of the major changes and some of the issues that we see across our surveys, which is even if you see more inclusivity from some, there's usually a population who feels like they're left behind, whether or not they are, and they can be a very powerful force.
Yes, and indeed, the elderly throughout Europe are a very powerful lobby at the expense of the younger people. Kalypso, a quick word, and then to Rosa.
You asked us maybe to think outside the box. I would say, dear Robert, hello. It depends what you mean by life, if I may, because because actually my vote would be more weighted the older I get.
I see. Yes, or well, it depends. Yes, especially with demography trends on both sides of the Atlantic. Rosa, you needn't answer the question if you don't want to, or else you can go on to life expectancy and the role of citizens.
Yeah, actually, if I may, I just wanted to add a couple of things on the economy and on climate change and the youth.
We've got 1 minute.
Yeah, 1 minute. First thing, the zeitgeist on the economy is changing. I mean, for the first time in 40 years, there's some serious questioning of globalization, as Danny Roderick calls it, or neoliberalism. And I think the findings in these reports really show that. And I also think governments are beginning to break some myths about austerity politics, about public debt. So we're entering in a different phase. First point. Second point, the climate emergency forces us to think for the future. And I think the younger generation perhaps will be inclined to take longer term perspectives and not the short term perspectives that we're seeing in politics today. Which leads me to my final point, which is more a question. And that's the great thing about Pew Research, is that it raises more questions than it answers. But it's a good thing. And that is, is it that we see a decline, we see a slight increase in progressive politics? Is it because we saw a decline in radical populist politicians? So Trump was voted out. In Britain, the Brexit debate became less important. There was, the surveys were done at the time of COVID. So is it that, or is it that politicians are simply responding to public moods? We don't get an answer there, but I think we can see some correlations, which are interesting.
That's really wraps it up well. And I think this, Richard and Laura, the fact that you brought in culture, economics, and politics together, one cannot exist without the other. The three is a terrific synergy. Thank you very, very much. And I can't thank you enough for coming on board with us, and Carnegie coming on board with Pew Research. Thank you very much. My last point, my last optimistic point, I don't know if I'm optimistic, but it's quite nice. The vaccinations that you wrote out. This is about the future. And I really like that you don't give recommendations. Because we can always, it means you can keep developing, and instead of, 10 years ago, you said this and this is going to happen. No recommendations, but lots of food for thought and a real focus on the future. Thank you very much, Laura and Richard. Thank you very much, Kalypso. Thank you very much, Rosa, and all the team behind who you don't see who made this possible. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.